Thank you. Yeah, as we get going, I'd love to just invite everybody to go into the chat and post in the chat your name, pronouns, location. My understanding is that maybe you're not all in the same exact place, same exact town. Wherever you are, and then yeah, it's a pretty intense time right now for a lot of folks who are tuned into anything political. And so, what's a feeling that you've had this week? And then maybe one name or place. Who or where do you turn when you need comfort or solace or some support? So if everybody can post that in the chat, that'll help me get to know you a little bit as we go a little bit into this workshop. Um, yeah. So talked a little bit about myself. That's my picture. You can still hear me and see me. Um, so I'll tell you a little bit about harnessing our power to end political violence, so which we abbreviate to HOPE PV. So HOPE PV is a collective of people that's committed to expanding democracy. And so what that means is in terms of the collective of people, 22nd Century Initiative is one of those organizations that's connected to this project. We're also the other core group member, kind of coordinator, is a group called the Horizons Project. Both of these organizations are committed to building a supermajority of people that are committed to democracy, to participation, to the idea that anybody who is impacted by policies, by governing structures, should have a say in how those governing structures and policies are made. And so that's what we mean when we say democracy. Hope PV also includes more than just the two organizations kind of at the center. We're also connected to a core group of organizations that includes the Carter Center, a group called Over Zero, the Women's March, as well as some other groups like Vision Change Win, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, that does safety and security around protest and around elections and that kind of thing. So we have there are a handful of other organizations. Another one that's kind of close to you geographically is the Rural Organizing Project, which is in Oregon. It's a pretty broad group of folks that have been working on this together, strategizing about how we can expand democracy, particularly in the face of political violence. Um, and so a few of the things that we are committed to is that, yeah, democracy is for everyone. We're many and we're in this together, right? Um, Nobody's humanity is in question. That's one of the kind of guiding values for us. So as we'll talk about it in a little while, almost everybody is against political violence, regardless of political party, regardless of geography, kind of across all indicators of and demographics and place. Most people, the vast majority of people, are against political violence. And so we have an approach that aims to be inclusive as we do this work. We also have a value that it's us that keep us safe. We keep us safe, right? Like we'll talk a little bit more about some of the strategies that we use to not only make political violence backfire, but to stay safe as well. But it's really up to us in our own communities. You know, one of the organizations that's connected to this project is People's Action, and the executive director there is a woman named Sulma Arias, and she talks about that in the face of authoritarianism or the rise of authoritarianism, the antidote to authoritarianism is connection. And so that's so much of what's at the center of what we're talking about today and what our organization is committed to. And then finally, you know, you see that little acronym HOPE, and so what we mean by HOPE is not just a feeling, not just not something vague, but something very concrete and material. Hope is creative. Hope is courageous. Hope is strategic, nonviolent action. When we do that together, that's what creates hope. And so that's where we're coming from. So today, my hope, for lack of a better word, is that we'll get a chance to explore some of the concepts that help us to identify and undermine political violence. We'll get to celebrate some of the ways that communities have creatively resisted political violence. We'll ideally awaken some imagination about how not only each of you individually, but also collectively can assertively respond in the face of threats or acts of political violence. And then finally, we'll get the ball rolling on planning a response if and when you ever need it. We'll have taken some steps in the direction of planning. So these are just a few of the things that we'll do to get there. We'll talk about the landscape. We will get into what I mean when I say political violence and backfire, and then we'll go into some strategy and talk about some next steps. So if any of you are like, this isn't what I signed up for tonight, this is now's the time. So this is where this is hopefully what you're here for. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit. Actually, I'm going to take down the screen share for just a sec. When you think about political violence, I'm using this phrase, and it has a lot of different connotations, a lot of different definitions. Something in particular might come to mind for you. And so what I want to encourage, you can do this in any way you want. You can do this inside of yourself. You don't actually have to say anything out loud. Or you can use one of the reactions, so one of the emojis, to indicate that, yes, this has happened to you, or this is something that you've witnessed. Or you can actually stand up. That's, if we were in person, I would be saying, stand up if you. Sometimes over the screen, that feels a little weird. So don't feel like you need to do that. And also when it comes to experiences of harassment, threat, even direct violence, it can bring up a lot. So I just want to encourage that that you take care of yourself. And so that might mean that you don't indicate that this has happened to you right now. It might mean that you do. But I just want to kind of run through a little bit of a list of some things. So I'm going to say stand up if you, but like I said, you don't have to stand. You can also just use an emoji, or you can just think it in your head. But stand up if you've ever experienced a threat of physical violence for your political activity, for your activism. Yeah, see some hands. Yeah. And yeah, raise your hand or stand up or put up an emoji if you've ever experienced harassment, either online or in real life, for some of your political activity. Yeah, handful of people. Yeah. If you've experienced doxing, which is when your personal information is published online for other people to see in ways that, especially people who might be against you politically. Yeah. Maybe there are even some folks here who have experienced direct physical violence. Either you or someone else, someone else in your community has actually been not only targeted, but hurt because of your political activity. And then finally, how many of you have experienced some fear or doubt or hesitation about political activity, because any of those things that I just listed might happen, and even if it's just a little bit of doubt. Yeah. Yeah, actually, one more. If you've witnessed somebody incite political violence, incite any of the things that I just named, or enable that. And I think this is one of those that all of us can raise our hand on, right? Because political violence is each of the things that I just named. It's not just physical violence, it's also threats, it's also harassment. It's also not just the person who commits the act. It's also the people who incite political violence and those who enable political violence. And so it's really any of those actions that's done with the intention of changing someone else's political behavior. And so that's really all of us, right? Like all of us at a certain level are the targets of political violence. And so, the impact of political violence, the intention of political violence is always to divide us, it's to distract us, it's to scare us, and it's to silence us while a very small group of people benefit politically, economically. We're in an age when in a specific period when acts of political violence have been on the rise for at least the last decade or so. And that was after a period where there wasn't as much political violence as there was in the 60s and 70s. And so this impact is there so that a small group of, as Hardy Merriman, who's the author of the guide to making political violence backfire that we're working from, says, he talks about this kind of class of political entrepreneurs who really, in some ways, kind of peddle in political violence and benefit from the fact that we're divided and distracted and afraid and silent while our rights are stripped away, while policies that are harmful are enacted. And so at a certain level, every single person who's tuned in to any kind of political activity, which is the majority of people, are targeted by political violence. None of us are exempt, right? And at the same time, some groups are more targeted than others. So, and this has been true since the beginning of this country. We started this meeting with land acknowledgement. The inception and immediate kind of aftermath of the founding of this country, and then every decade since, there are plenty of examples of political violence, as I've just named it, on small and large scales, right? And so those groups that are most targeted include Black folks, and that's still true today. As someone in our group recently said, who works with activists and organizers in rural North Carolina, the people there who are trying to figure out how to vote safely are experiencing the same violence from the same people as their grandparents did. So that's been true for a long time, and it continues to be true. LGBTQIA plus people are also more targeted than others. Immigrants and refugees more targeted than others, as anybody who's watched the news recently, right? What happened to the community of Haitian migrants in Springfield, Ohio, or listens to any of the rhetoric in the current national political campaigns, that immigrants are squarely targeted. And women are more targeted than anybody else, than other people, as well as activists in the news. So this has been true for a long time. It makes sense that many of you raised your hand for so many of the things that I said earlier. Over the last 8 years or so, as political violence has gone on the rise, local elections workers are some of the folks who are most targeted, as well as local elected officials and state lawmakers. So this is the kind of terrain that we're navigating right now, is that not only are none of us exempt from the possibility of political violence, there are some groups that continue to be more targeted than others. And so the good news in the face of all of this is that most people, as I mentioned, so this is just one snapshot of how we can think about public opinion, and the sheer number of potential allies we have in as we organize to end political violence, is that vast majority of people across political party. This is also true across geography. It's true in many different ways that this kind of question is asked, but upwards of 80% of people are opposed to political violence. So that means that we are a massive majority who believe that political violence is never okay. Right. And so, and that violence really is never an okay way to express our political opinions. Um, and so, um, the where we are now is that we need to figure out ways to organize as many people as possible to make sure that if and when more political violence happens in your community nationally, if there's another kind of January 6th kind of moment, that we have more relationships, more connections, more capacity for collective action. So that's kind of the foundation of where this project is coming from. So I just want to kind of pause there, see if there are any questions about just what political violence means, if anybody has anything kind of burning that you want to share with the group, any reflections on what I've shared so far. And including if you're surprised by anything or are not surprised by anything.
A couple people have their hands up, but that may be leftover from the event, the kind of that activity. So if you do have something to say, please unmute and say it.
I've got a question. This
Great.
is Bruce.
Hi, Bruce.
First off, thank you very much for coming and talking, and thank you for having an organized presentation. I was wondering first if you could put into the chat, or if there's the resource, a link for Hardy Merriman's guide or article on how to make political violence backfire. That would be, he's a wonderful, wonderful scholar and be very helpful.
Definitely.
So I'm looking at the polling data that you've put up, and it looks like it was in the footnote. It was an amalgamation of various polls, and that this was kind of a poll averaging, if you will. Is that right?
Yes.
And so my question relates to, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Movement Action Plan by Bill Moyer in the book Doing Democracy. Have you heard of that?
I don't feel I've heard of it. I don't feel competent in saying much about it, but
well, the Movement Action Plan, Bill studied social movements, and he was a nonviolent activist for many years prior to his death, and that he traced the movements going through 8 phases, and the things that you would watch for to try to ascertain what phase is this movement in was mostly on public awareness of an issue, public attitudes against the power holders, and then finally public attitudes and actions, willingness to take action in favor of the movement's goals or the new position. And, you know, he had various dynamics. It's a good book and I recommend it. But in any event, with that large majority, you're already placing this movement to end political violence in one of the later stages of that 8 stage. And so the tactics change. But I contrast that with Erica Chenoweth's work, where she points out that the nonviolent movements have succeeded in toppling dictators when only 3.5% on average of the population was willing to take action. So I look at this poll data that you put up, flip it and say, oh my gosh, there's 15% of the population that is saying, yeah, political violence is okay in certain circumstances. And so I worry about, the percentage of people that engaged in political violence on January 6th was very small. But the potential impact of that was pretty large. So it's nonviolent non-cooperation is great when you're going up against a state repressive regime, but when you're going up against sort of random acts of Proud Boys terrorizing people, nonviolent intervention is difficult, and nonviolent non-cooperation is difficult. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on, how do we address the growing threat from apparently 15% of the population who are ready to support the Proud Boys.
Totally. Yeah, that's actually the whole rest of this workshop in many ways. And why we think about it as backfire. So we're essentially using a model that was developed by another researcher named Brian Martin, who's Australian, and who similarly kind of looked at asked the question, why in some circumstances do nonviolent social movements take actions that seem to make political violence backfire, and why other times does it not seem to work, and then developed out this kind of 5-step framework. So I'll be sharing that in a few minutes.
Great.
Yeah. But I think, I still think that it's one of the things that's challenging about this, or another thing that's challenging kind of about this supermajority of people who say that they're opposed to political violence, is two things. One is that answering a question on survey is really different than taking action, right? And I think that's kind of the fundamental kind of challenge that we have. And then the other is that the narrative about political violence tends to be, so when people who are not necessarily as active as any of you are think about political violence, their understanding of the kind of common understanding of political violence is filtered through kind of dominant narratives that are in the news. And so the sense that violence means direct physical violence, means things like assassination attempts and that kind of thing, and only that. And then also that, people of stature, like politicians, like candidates, et cetera, are the only valid targets. And so then we don't tend to think of ourselves as the targets of political violence. And so I think in addition to equipping groups like yours with these backfire principles and strategies, there is also, we're all activists, we're all organizers in this room. Like there's always outreach for us to do, right? Like there's always more for us to build. And so that's part of the kind of theory here as well. So and I appreciate the chat being alive with resources, including a link to the Movement Action Plan. And so what I want to invite is we're going to, in a moment, go into some smaller groups for a short time, and then we'll go into the backfire principles. But I'm going to invite everybody to close your eyes if you're comfortable, and just let yourself kind of settle into your seat or wherever you are. Just get a little more present in the present moment. Maybe look around the room if you need to, just to kind of settle yourself. And then take a few breaths. We'll take a few breaths together. So a breath in, a breath out, a breath in, breath out. Just noticing what it's like to be alive in this body in this moment. With all of your experiences, with all of your commitments to peace, to nonviolence, the possibility of a different world. All that's here right now. And I want you to call to mind a person in your life that you turn to. Everybody has shared at least one of those folks, but if you were in trouble, who would you call? Think about a person in your life with some skill, with some experience, with some competence, that if they can support you to be safe, if you need to be safe, that can help you problem solve if you need to problem solve. You might notice that there's more than one person that comes to mind, and that's okay. Even let yourself kind of cycle through the images of the faces of the people in your life, including maybe even some of the people on this call, that if you received a threat, if you experienced harassment, if you were afraid to take political action, you might share with them, with each of these people, what was going on and ask for some support. And just let yourself feel what it feels like to know that you have at least one person. There's 20 people on this call, so maybe there's at least 18 others. You don't quite know me yet. And maybe there are folks outside of the circle, a friend or a neighbor or a colleague. When you're ready, you can go ahead and open your eyes. I'm just gonna reorient to being in this space. And in a moment, I'm gonna put us into breakout rooms. And in those breakout rooms, you get a chance to just, for a few minutes, share a little bit about maybe one of those people that came up for you, maybe more. And a little bit about what it's like to have folks in your life that you can turn to if something happens. So we'll just post that in the chat real quick. We'll take, I think there are about 3 people in each breakout room. So we'll take about 7 or 8 minutes in these breakout rooms just to have this little conversation kind of grounding in. Yeah, I see a hand.
Since we don't have 2 computers, if there are couples, I imagine you'll put them in the same room.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, totally. All right. Opening the rooms now. And see you back here in yeah, about 6, 7 minutes. If you're having trouble joining, let me know. I can do my best to help. Welcome back, everybody.
Mhm.
Curious just to hear a few reflections. Just how was that for you? How is it for you to kind of recognize that? You talk about those, hear from each other about some of the people in each other's lives. Maybe just hear from a few people how you're feeling and how that felt. Go ahead and come off mute if, whenever you're ready and jump in.
I think for us, there was some uncertainty as to what we were supposed to do.
Mhm. So others have similar experience or different?
Yeah, I don't know how to say it any better. We were kind of uncertain as to how to proceed.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
It was our group. We thought of a number of uh, people in our lives that would be there for us, would have our backs, and it was helpful for me to think about some of the nonviolence training that I've had in the past, and think there are lots of skills out there. There are lots of tactics that can come into play now. So it felt good to remember those.
Awesome. Great. Yeah. One or two other people? Anything else come up? Yeah. Let's see, Louise.
Yeah, I felt depending on what the issue was as to who I might call on for support. And so I feel shared that I feel very lucky that there are people in most aspects of my life that I could go to and say, this is really driving me nuts. Whether it's my neighbor or FOR people or FCNL people or UFM people or whatever, it depends on what the problem is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Nice. Louise. Maybe one more person?
Well, I think for myself, I would refer to the community of activists.
Yeah.
So it's not one person, but I feel that whole community would be holding watching my back.
Yeah.
And then also I'm involved with the church, so that would also be a resource for me.
Definitely. Great. Yes. And I think that's the foundation of so much of how political of the backfire principle is in our relationships. And so for any of you, and this is probably true for all of you, if not most of you, if not all, then most of you, that anytime you've ever been in a really well-planned action, something has gone a little sideways, right? Like there's really kind of no such thing as a perfectly executed plan. A friend of mine who does a lot of political strategy likes to say that no plan survives contact with the real world. And so what do we do when that happens? We turn to each other, and really, if you've been in a direct action or a more kind of intense experience, it's our relationships that we lean in on, right? Like we can move together because we're already connected. And so that's the foundation of this practice, and then and of this kind of strategy. It's rooted in everything that you know about strategic nonviolent action already, right? And with some of the groups that we work with, we're really introducing those concepts, but that's not necessarily true here. And so you have an opportunity to kind of carry some of that into the rest of your community. So that's part of why I'm also thinking like there might have been some friends or neighbors that haven't really been activists, but you might still call on them. And so this is an opportunity to kind of bring them into the movement that you've been building for as long as you've been building it. And so just to give an example too, to the question that was raised earlier, I see Janice's name on there, so I don't know your name who raised the question, but
Bruce.
Bruce, right? You did say that. I'll just share. We're all probably familiar with the story of Martin Luther King and John Lewis and others marching from Selma to Montgomery, right, and crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the story of Bloody Sunday. And we also all are really familiar with the aftermath of that, that this was a strategically planned and implemented action in the midst of a campaign to expand voting rights, in which they were prepared to face physical violence from police and from potentially from civilians, from people who lived in those communities. And in the wake of that initial march, which had something like 600 people in it, within a couple of days, 2,000 people were marching. And within a few weeks, 50,000 people were gathered in Montgomery. And within just a few months, President Johnson had signed a new Voting Rights Act, right? And so that's kind of the power of backfire when we strategize. And again, for any of you who have been committed, all of you have been committed to nonviolence for a long time, you know the power of a well thought out action. But it's also, you also know that it's not just stuff that happened in the past. It's not just the civil rights movement. It's not just the Indian independence movement. It's not just, any of those things that happened previously, but it's happening now. And so the story that I just want to share briefly is from a small town in Montana called Whitefish, where it was just town about 8,000 people, which is, it's, known for natural beauty. There's occasionally a celebrity who kind of comes through. But in late 2017, there was, you might have seen this, some national news coverage of a plan for that a group of neo-Nazis were going to march through this town. And it had originated with some threats against a local Jewish real estate agent. And so, the initial threats had escalated. Her name was being broadcast over right-wing media. People were starting to kind of descend on this town with their attention, and then planned this march for an armed march for Martin Luther King Day in 2018. And so this wasn't the first time that this community had experienced something like this. And so there was a group called Love Lives Here that had formed. And so they were prepared. They knew that there was something that they could do to respond to this, not only to protect their community member, but to show that something else is possible, that these aren't the values of this town, and also these aren't the values of this area, and they're going to increase the cost for this group. And so what they decided to do as the date of the march approached, businesses that had relied on tourism and kind of had a strong interest in countering perceptions and those kinds of things, everybody got on board, and Love Lives Here, along with other organizers, helped to get all of the businesses kind of along the planned route to post Love Lives Here stickers in their windows, along with images of menorahs and more. And so that started happening, but of course that wasn't the end of the story. The people who had planned the march only escalated their tactics and started harassing those local businesses, started posting negative reviews online of the businesses to try to intimidate owners and other community members. But the local organizers had other strategies in mind as well. And so they managed to organize people from around the state and through their national network to counter those negative reviews with a flood of positive reviews. They in some ways, this is exactly what civil resistance scholars might call something like a reverse boycott. So we recently saw something very similar happen in Springfield, right, where people just started kind of flooding businesses with positive reviews and with patronage. And then the week before the scheduled march, hundreds of families showed up to a Love Not Hate rally that emphasized welcome, emphasized, you know, tolerance, created what they called the matzo ball soup brigade, wore blue wigs to troll the trolls. Like they did all the things that they could to kind of express collective action. And the other thing that they did is that they created a pledge so that for every mile, every mile that the marchers marched, they would donate money to people would donate money to Love Lives Here. And so that, you know, both show of collective power showed something else needs to happen here. Something else is already here. We are not for this. And then also the economic kind of cost of like, if we're going to actually do this march, we're going to be raising money for these folks that we're trying to oppose. It created a dilemma for them, the people who are trying to organize this march. And so not only were they, you know, were they already disincentivized from doing this, but also it created some space where the local government officials could also resist the pressure to allow the march to go forward, and ended up denying the permits. And so I think that's an example of people power that I think resonates, but it also has these elements of backfire, making it so that it's not viable for the people who are trying to organize this, you know, something that is political violence, right? Like it's targeting a specific person in this case. So not only was she safe and knew that the whole community had her back, but the folks who were coming to intimidate her at you know, best didn't come. And so that's the kind of thing that I think actually you know, it goes back to what you were saying, Bruce, is like it takes a few people to be able to do something like this, and then it brings a lot more people in. Oh, there's actually something that we can do, right? So yeah, let me share a little bit about this framework just to kind of go back through the story, and you might think of other stories along the way. There's plenty of examples of how this works. So and I appreciate seeing the love it backfiring in the chat. If you have other reflections, reactions, feel free to share them there. So first, you know, this framework comes from a man named Brian Martin. So the first thing that he looked at, I'm sorry, I think my screen is blocking, is looking at the kind of mechanics of political violence, which is a strategy of authoritarianism, right? So looking at the ways that it's not just the you know, the neo-Nazis, the white nationalists, other kind of civilian groups. We can also look at plenty of examples of political violence that is, you know, violence against protesters, for example, by police officers, or in many cases, some of the people who are inciting political violence are, you know, elected officials. And so there's state violence in there too. And the playbook is essentially that the people who are perpetrating political violence try to cover it up first. You know, if you look at any example from Rodney King to George Floyd, if there wasn't somebody with a cell phone, if there wasn't somebody you know, recording that footage, it very likely would have gone away it would never have been in the public imagination, right? Or like the public view. And so that is a strategy, is to cover it up. And in this day and age, with so much online activity and including online harassment, one of the ways that cover up kind of manifests is the anonymity of the online space. That people feel, you know, somehow empowered to act in ways that they wouldn't otherwise, because it's so easy to kind of cover it up through the anonymity. The second step is that they'll try to devalue the target. Again, familiar, right? And and then they'll try to reinterpret what happened in their favor. They might minimize it. They might say, actually, it's a group of people that deserved it. This playbook you can see in really stark detail in what happened when Haitian migrants were recently targeted in Springfield. That people were dehumanized. There was so much kind of backpedaling and doubling down to say, well, actually, look at the impact on this town, right? And so it's reinterpreting what happened in the favor of the people who committed the act of political violence. The fourth step is that it can get hijacked into official channels. And so, there's going to be an inquiry, there's going to be a study, there's going to be, we're going to investigate, but then that goes behind closed doors and it might last a very long time. And so the people who are targets may continue to feel the heat of that being targeted and all of that. And then finally, bribes and intimidation. So if you do speak up, in the face of political violence, you might receive more intimidation, more threats, more harassment, and there might be actual rewards for your silence. And so that's the basic playbook. And so we can counter each of those steps. So in the face of cover-up, what we can do is we can reveal, we can expose the injustice. And so this is part of why at the very beginning I asked the question, who here has experienced each of these things? I imagine it feels kind of hard. It feels vulnerable to say, actually, yeah, I have been targeted in these kinds of ways. I have experienced these kinds of ways. There may be some doubt. Was this as harmful as I think it might have been? Does this count? Yes, the answer is yes, right? And so how do we not only reveal what has happened to us, to the people who are close to us, which I think is a very important first step, because we're gathering our people. We need to stay powerful. We're also we also need to devise strategies and tactics to be able to get to reveal the injustice, expose the injustice to wider audiences as well. In the face of devaluing the target or the victim, we can redeem that and validate the target. We can rehumanize that person. We can tell a fuller story of who that person is. We can show up with the things that person might need to feel safe and feel supported, help them navigate any services that they might need, right? Or even just make sure that they get a hot meal in the wake of what's been happening. But each of those things help to kind of redeem and validate the target. And then we do that in public. We tell a story of the people who, of who that person was, right? And so again, recent example in Springfield of how many people have spoken out and talked about their friends and neighbors who are part of that community that had been targeted. The reverse boycotts are an example of that as well. Similarly, recently was involved in a campaign in New Jersey where a person who was a part of a peacemaking team, an anti-violence activist named Najee Seabrooks, a couple of years ago, had a mental health crisis, and he called the police. And the police showed up, as well as his friends and coworkers at the Patterson Healing Collective, which was a peace activist organization. But the police not only didn't they not let the anti-violence activists support their friend and colleague, they ended up killing him. And in the wake of that, how many times we've seen the news after a young Black man has been killed by police with language that dehumanizes. The group was able to organize media and organize local organizations to immediately stand up and say, no, Najee was a peacemaker, and look at his smile, look at the impact that he's had on this community. And that ended up being the narrative. And then within a year and a half, the communities that continued to organize we're able to pass a bill that just passed this January that creates more resources for community based responses to mental health crisis, so that it's not in the hands of police, it's actually in the hands of community organizations. And so, you know, when we validate the target, we also bring people together, right? When it comes to reinterpreting, we can make sure that we always reframe the event as an injustice. So every time we make sure that it's not an isolated event, right? Like we make sure that it's not just a single thing that's happening, but it's connected to this broader context. We make sure that it's that you know, in the context of having exposed the injustice, we're also sharing who benefits. You know, this isn't, again, it's not isolated, and it's not disconnected from, or it's not disconnected from other political activity that's happening. It's actually an injustice that people are harassed or targeted in some other kind of way. Rather than as there's this impulse to kind of go into official channels, we can make sure that we're also mobilizing support. We're mobilizing our communities, mobilizing more action, so that we can make sure that it doesn't just go behind closed doors. And that's not to say that official channels can't be supportive, right? Like sometimes government intervention, law enforcement intervention can be supportive to the person who's being targeted, and it's never enough. What is always true is that people power, community power will support and protect. And then in the face of intimidation and bribes, we resist those. And that looks like, again, kind of, you could see this not so much as a linear list, but as a cycle in some ways, right? Like, so, you know, if we're receiving more intimidation, more threats, or even bribes, we cycle back through and we reveal the injustice, we redeem the target, we make sure that we're reframing at every step of the way, and resisting. So gonna pause there, and I'm actually looking at time. I'm thinking that we take a 10-minute break after this, but I want to see if there are any questions or reflections just on this framework of these 5 R's before we take a short break, and then come back and do a little activity to move us towards the end. Any questions? Let's
If nobody else does, I'll jump in again.
go for it.
But the questions that I've got, Java, would be, one, I think we are now living in a time that is very different than Martin Luther King's time, where people are media saturated. We're in the heart of the information age and on the cusp of the artificial intelligence age. And so the revealing that, on the one hand, we've got cell phones now that can show us, you know, George Floyd's injustice. But on the other hand, we've got people siloing so that they only watch Fox News because they're reinforcing, or on their social media channels, they only they cut off all the people that don't agree with them, and they silo. So I'd be curious as to what you think about how to do that reveal step when our communications environment is so different than it was, you know, 20 years ago. And then the second part of that is, being on the cusp of the artificial intelligence age, we're now at a spot where I think almost no one will be trusting that I'll believe it when I see it. That's going to go by the wayside, because the artificial intelligence propaganda is going to be, the disinformation is going to be ballooning exponentially in the next several years, and used in all sorts of creative process. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that also, I think, presents problems for us that have not been encountered by prior nonviolent activists.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, there's a whole there's a whole workshop in itself that could be about mis and disinformation, right? And I think part of the challenge with mis and disinformation is the kind of like the impulse to engage in when we see it, and really what we need to be doing, this is a really super shorthand kind of answer, is telling the truth over and over and over again, and telling a story about, in this case, when it comes to political violence, and backfire, telling a story of what's possible with collective action. And so, for example, in the wake of the assassination attempt that happened in July, there were several kind of competing dominant narratives that ended up all over the news about who the shooter was and all these kinds of things, right? And so the kind of and then also about why and about whether it even happened, all those kinds of things. So there's conspiracy theory, there's misinformation, there's disinformation, there's all this kind of stuff. And the other thing that was happening was that this kind of similar like dominant narrative about that only politicians, only elected officials like that are targets of political violence, and that law enforcement is the only response. And so, in the wake of that, in the sea of disinformation and misinformation, what people can do, and what many people did do, this is kind of when we were launching our project, is we had a lot of inquiries of like, what could we do instead? And so then telling the story of what we can do instead became part of the intervention in and of itself in that moment. And so now we have, this kind of growing network of folks who are getting introduced to these concepts, and then some groups that are going even deeper into different aspects. And like I said, Reveal could be its own training in and of itself, right? And so we'll go a little bit more into some of those tactics in a few minutes. But I think what you're raising is just really good points. And to me, the other thing as a student of nonviolence, I think this is probably true for all of you as well, is that we know that just about a second after we have an effective tactic out into the world, we got to be creative and find a new one, right? And so that's kind of like the constancy of creativity in our commitments to nonviolent action is only amplified to me in this era, like at this time, that we have to stay as creative as anybody else, more creative than anybody else, in order to counter this kind of stuff. So yeah, I see a hand, Vivi.
My question is that sometimes when there are situations that make us so angry, and a lot of people that are demonstrating with the same belief that you have, but they're so angry, they want to return violence with violence. And how do we show that the violence is not what we need to do?
Yeah, totally. I think that's a huge and important question. And I think the word that I would kind of lean in on that you just said is show. I think we can kind of, tell people over and over and over again about the power of strategic nonviolent action. And the fact of the matter is that it's kind of outside of the bounds of what so many people have considered. And then also, people are frustrated and tired and maybe have tried different things over time and that kind of stuff. And so we can kind of argue until we're blue in the face, right? And so to me, the best thing that we can do is we can organize and we can show what is possible. And I think that that's, you know, more true today than, or as true today as ever. That we need to support people, you know, and we need to support people to see that something else is possible. The other thing that we can do is we can tell stories, like the story of Montana. You know, we can tell familiar stories, but draw out pieces like the Selma kind of story. We can show that that's possible. There are other stories as well, and one of the things that we're working on right now is a kind of longer database or longer not a database, but like a page on our website that will have access to many stories of what backfire looks like. Kind of adapting some stories that Brian Martin has already. He's got, you know, dozens of stories on his website, but specific to the U.S. context. So you know, one of the other thing that I think is important in this kind of context about, right? I think there's two things. One is when there's a question of nonviolence or not. You know, we will each kind of land on our answer to that question, especially if we have a commitment to nonviolence for different reasons, right? Like some of that is moral, some of it's pragmatic. And I think it's generally, I've worked with organizations and been part of groups of people that where that is a big disagreement. And so kind of thinking about how do we position ourselves when there needs to be a diversity of tactics. We can stay committed. We can keep our commitment to strategic nonviolence. I think that's really important. And for all the reasons that a few of you have named before, is also a practical and pragmatic set of strategies. And then I think the other thing that we can say to people is that nonviolent action comes with it. It leans into the participation advantage that we have. You know, if there are 80% of people that are at least, you know, in some kind of way with us on something, how do we get more of those people to show up? And there's a ton of research out there. Someone mentioned Erica Chenoweth earlier. She wrote a book with Maria Steffen called Why Civil Resistance Works, and they go into more detail there. But you know, that basically shows that when there are nonviolent action or nonviolent social movements, more people participate than when there's not a commitment to nonviolence. And so that kind of level of participation is at the heart of democracy in so many ways, right? And so that's part of what why we're calling for these kinds of actions right now as well. So that's a lot of different ways that I might kind of answer, but like I said, I think it's in the showing. I think it's in kind of the doing of the action. That's always been that's what brought me into the movement, you know, and that's what I've seen bring so many other people into the movement as well. But I think both of those questions that just came up are really good for the small groups that we'll do right after this. And I do want to propose, like, we've been here for an hour and 21 minutes, which is too much time sitting and staring at a screen. So I want to encourage that we take maybe a 5-minute break, refill your water or teacup or whatever it is that you're drinking, stretch your legs a little bit, and come back at in 5 minutes. So 7:56. I'll put that up on the screen. Sound good?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, they gave us a break. So, you know what George is doing.
Welcome back. So, I want to spend a little bit of time kind of digging in a bit about or into tactics that you can use. Sometimes we use another case study. You know, we can kind of give you some of the specifics, some of the details, and then you get a chance to kind of think about what would you do. But because y'all are pretty experienced activists, connected to an organization, I'm gonna leave it a little less defined. I think we probably all have a sense of the kinds of threats that we might be facing, right? And so in the small groups, what we'll do is, first of all, let me pull up an example of what we're going to do. What we're going to do is yeah, talk about how we might you know, to Vivi's point before, like how we might show that this works, if and when someone in your communities, and that community is, you know, writ large, right? Like, so it might be the whole Fellowship of Reconciliation in Western Washington. It might be the whole national network. It might be networks of others that you're connected to. But if anybody in that network, if anybody in your orbit, and experiences political violence, how might you mobilize? So in each of the small groups, you're going to have a chance to kind of engage that question and go through the list of each of the 5 R's and come up with some ideas. How might we reveal the injustice? How might we redeem the target? How might we reframe? Guessing we won't get much farther than those 3, but if you get further, great. We're going to take about, well, why don't we actually stay in the same groups that we were in before? We'll keep the groups pretty small, so that you have some chance to brainstorm together. Actually, no, I'm gonna remake the room. Sorry. I'm just going to do 4 rooms. So the way that this will work, let me show you my screen, is you're going to be kind of tapping into your experience. And we'll use, I'm going to share with you this this slide. And you can see at the bottom of each slide, there's a group number. So you'll see which group you're in. Someone in your group will track which group you're in, hopefully. Slides 32, 33, 34, and 35 are all the same. They're just group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4. So for your group, what you'll do is you'll go in, you can double click on the slide, and you can just take some notes. What are some tactics that can help you reveal political violence? What are some tactics that can help you redeem? And what are some tactics that can help you reframe? I see a hand. I see Jean's hand.
I was wondering, do you want us to come up with our own ideas of what might happen that we are responding to, or?
Yeah, I think it's a good place to start. I think it's a good place to kind of have a little bit of a conversation about this is a thing that we expect might happen. And just so everybody's on the same page in your group, and then take a few minutes and even if you just get through reveal, I think that's fine. You know, this is the beginning of a conversation, and then we'll come back and share a little bit about what it was. And I'm about to share this whole deck with you, and it's got way more. It's got like 85 slides in it. So there's other stuff that you can draw from as you plan beyond today's meeting. But this is the link to the deck, so that the slideshow, so that you can all have that. And so if you end up in group 1, this is the slide that you'll use. If you end up in group 2 or 3 or 4, then find the right one. Appoint somebody to be the note taker in your group, although anybody, you might all just go in and type a little bit with some of those ideas. And we'll take 15 minutes in these smaller groups, and then we'll come back and share a little bit, and then we'll close out together with some next steps and some other resources that you can use. So any questions?
Excuse me, Gene, could I, it sounded like Gene was asking for a real situation to respond to.
Yes.
So I'd like to propose one just real quickly, if we could. In 2016, December 2016, those of us in Friends meeting heard a credible report that Nazis were going to march on Capitol Hill with the intention of doing violence. This is a real situation, actually. We actually did get this report, and along with a lot of other groups across the city, we organized a counter mobilization just to be present in what's it called, Cal Anderson Park. So that was the situation. You know, there was credible reports that a Nazi march was going to take place with violence promised, and people did in fact mobilize to oppose that.
Great.
Is that appropriate?
Yeah, totally. That is exactly right. So I'm going to post that in the chat. I'm doing a real even shorter version than you just did. In your small group, you can respond to this. Can be the situation that you're responding to, but there might be another one in your group too. So that's okay if you have a different idea of something. But this feels like it's pretty relevant.
This is actually Capitol Hill in Seattle, not the national capital we're talking about. But
great.
Well, it could be any capital. It's fine.
It could be any capital. Could be Olympia.
So you feel free to use that. Feel free to come up with a different scenario, but spend the bulk of your time coming up with some ideas for some tactics. All right. I'm going to open the breakout rooms now, and we'll be back, in about probably be more like 12 minutes. So this will be quick. Welcome back, everybody. Nice to see you. Gosh, 2 hours sure goes by fast, doesn't it? I'm curious, not so much to go into detail, like not report backs, right? But I'm just curious how it was for you. So maybe a feeling, maybe an aha, but maybe just hear from a few people, just how it was for you to have this discussion of some tactics that you might employ. So again, not listing out the tactics that you wrote down, more of a, how do you feel? Yeah, go for it, Kath.
Yeah, I think the overall responses we got was, I loved how it was solution oriented. You know, we compared notes on what has worked for even current successes, just like ranked choice voting or email lists or emailing city council, because technology allows us to contact them and let them know what's happening without waiting for a council meeting. In terms of redeeming or reframing, you know, support the businesses of people that are being othered, send a message that everybody belongs, everybody's worthy of dignity and respect. It's about connections. It's about countering whatever the negativity is with positivity, and it's easy for people to jump on board with it.
Right. Nice. Love that.
I was gratified with the fact that it was a given that of course we would respond. Hooray.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, I might take that with me, Mary. Yeah, that is definitely an assumption. If you're coming to this thing, you're walking away with you're going to do something. So I appreciate that. I hadn't really. Yeah, go ahead.
One story from the real event was I was on public transit on my way to it and ran into a couple people, one of whom said to a black person, "Well, I have your back, whatever happens." So if we can all just encourage each other to say that, just make that one of the organizing principles.
How meaningful it is to have those experiences of connection in the midst of collective action too, that's what brings more people in as well, and then we're more powerful together. Yeah, what other reflections just from doing that?
I think we try to exploit all the different ways that you can get information out to people: news sources, schools, churches, and contacting the mayor was mentioned, the city council, and also organizing a possibility of a counter march.
Yeah, and so just kind of thinking through all of those, how did it feel to kind of have the list going like that?
But I think there's really no holds barred. Any way you can get the information out are certainly something to be exploited or used.
Yeah.
I feel a sense of agency by hearing other people's ideas, more ways to be empowered.
Yeah. And I think that what actually all of you said, I think is really important is, some people that we're working with are like, we're organizing a march next week, or we're organizing an action next week, or this thing just happened. We just received this threat, and now we need to strategize together to do something. But for most of the people that we're working with right now, it's a little bit of science fiction, right? Like it's a little bit of like, we don't quite know what's going to happen, but we want to be prepared. And so I think that piece that you just said, Kath, that sense of agency is, I think, really important. And then Bob, what you said as well is really important, is like the sense that we can think through every possible way of getting this out into the world, of every possible way of letting the world know that this is a human being that's been targeted, or these are human beings that have been targeted. And again, I keep on thinking a lot. I'm thinking a lot about what's happened in Springfield, but some of the folks from our collective were there, we're helping out, we're resourcing some of those actions and those kinds of things. But by and large, most people just started joining, right? They just started seeing that it was important to speak up. It was important to speak up for their neighbors. It was important to speak up for the local businesses. It was important to protect each other in the face of escalating threats and that kind of thing. And so I think having this muscle working this muscle of creativity helps you be prepared if and when something comes up. And it's not unlikely, right, that in the wake of this election, there could be something. Even before this election, there could be something. We also know that that political violence is not a new phenomenon, right? And it's been here for a long time. So it will show up in some kind of way. And so even if it's not directly in your community, hopefully you have some more sense of connection of how you can collectively respond, even if it's something that happens in a different state or something like that. And yeah, Kath, I see your hand again too.
Yeah, thanks for letting me speak. I'm just ponying back on your idea of collective response. I think to lay the foundation for that, I just listened to a workshop by Joan Blade. She's one of the founders of MoveOn.org, who's encouraging the movement called Living Room Conversations. If you look it up, it's livingroomconversations.org, where it just encourages. So I'm starting up something really simple at my own home. It's called First Fridays Living Room Conversations. And since it's an election, I'm inviting, anybody, whether it's neighbors or fellow parents or anybody within our community, to come and just talk about and compare notes of, hey, what are the measures? Because we don't have time to go through and research everything. We did come up with a bit of a voter's guide right now, just from other parents that I know are informed or working with nonprofits that keep track of the data. So they are my trusted sources, but I don't have all the answers. It's those kinds of things to lay the groundwork to have the community and the conversation of trusted people and trusted sources start forming. What do you think?
Nice. Yeah, I think that piece is really important. Staying connected with each other, kind of embodying something really different. Like those are the foundations of that'll support us to take action together. And then I think you add this piece of backfire if into the kind of strategic little satchel that we all carry around. David, I see your hand, and then I'm going to move us into a close for today.
Yeah, thank you. In our last group, one of the things that I was thinking and very impressed with was one of the members was talking about some very creative ideas that a group of them had come together with prior to engaging a counter march. And it struck me that I've been thinking off and on throughout this program about how important it is for people to, like us activists, to consistently, and particularly now coming up before this election and afterwards, regardless of what happens, is that we're going to perhaps need each other more than any time before in our lifetime, perhaps, in terms of supporting each other and planning ahead, and because without that we can get into a lot of fight, flight, or freeze kind of responses when we get out into a group, and that's not what we want to do. We want to act on our values. And you've got to really be disciplined. Like James Lawson said, you really got to consistently be disciplined to do that. It's not easy, but it can be done. That's right.
That's right. I appreciate that you said the way that you said that too. The part of the way that I've been thinking about this is, if the intention of political violence is to divide us, is to scare us, is to silence us, it's tapping into the collective freeze state, right? And so what do we need to do? We need to thaw the freeze state, and that is an action. We have to take action together. And so I appreciate kind of ending with that. There's plenty more that we can do on this, right? Like we have plenty of other resources. Someone posted the guide to making political violence backfire in the chat earlier. So I'm going to post a different link, but it's the same website. So you'll see the link to the guide there too. But this is our resources page. On that resources page, there are a few videos of different kind of examples. There's a longer conversation that includes Hardy as well as some other leaders in the field who are part of our collective. There are some articles that you can read and share with folks, including an introduction to strategic nonviolence for this moment, a narrative guide, and then some examples. So there's a few resources there. I'm also going to share one of the other things that we want to make sure that is on everybody's mind is digital and physical security, which is not something that we specifically do, but members of our collective do. And so some resources include this website that our friends at Over Zero are curating. And then I mentioned this group earlier, Vision Change Win, has some toolkit for protest safety and those kinds of things. But if you're interested in kind of going more into digital security, Jean has my contact information. I'll also post it in the chat. We can help you get connected to organizations that do that kind of thing as well. So those are just a few resources that I wanted to share. I also mentioned the 22nd Century Initiative, which is the organization that I'm working with on this project. You can find out more there. The 22nd Century Initiative and the Horizons Project are the two organizations that are funding this project. And so if contributing, this is freely offered. I just want to be clear about that. But if you're interested in contributing into this so that it's accessible to as many people as possible for as long as possible, you'll see the donation link there. But it's not a hard ask. And then finally, I'm just going to share this. Is a little survey that'll give us a little bit of information about how this landed for you. I can't believe that it's already been 2 hours. There were at least 2 other activities I had kind of up my sleeve that we might do together. And I think a couple of them were more intro level than what your crew needed. And so, but in that deck that I shared, in the slideshow that I shared, there are several other things in there as well. So if you scroll down through it, you'll find some images and some graphics that you're free to use and post on social media if you want. There's more information. There's a few more stories. So there's the story of Selma. There's the story of Whitefish, Montana. There's the story of activists in rural Oregon when the militia tried to take over the Malheur National Park a few years ago. What community members did there. There's a much more like a story that just culminated in April of this year, where a group of folks found out that in Oklahoma, a small town in Oklahoma, that a city councilor had marched in Charlottesville, and they organized to recall him using some of these kinds of tactics as well. And so there's more stories in here as well. Feel free to use them. There's a few graphs and other kinds of data points as well. And I'm also available to follow up. We have a team of skilled folks as well. If you want to go deeper on any of these concepts, we can figure out a way to do that. Including, we have some people who are closer to you geographically. It's just that nobody could make it tonight. So Matt Wynn in particular, who I think has done some work with all of you, he's the one who designed this training, although I adapted it quite a bit tonight. But there are others in the neighborhood who could also potentially support in preparation if you want to do more. So I'll leave it there. Would love to see, if you want to just post a word or two about how you are, maybe a takeaway, a feeling. That would be maybe a nice way to close this out. I've really appreciated getting a chance to meet all of you, and knowing that you're in the world, knowing that you're in this part of the world as well, doing what you're doing. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shiva. I am stopping the recording.